This session would bring in a much more integrated fashion the interreligious dimension of this conference, and Shai would talk to us about Jews, Muslims, the secular Christian states, and he would focus on a particular issue which has emerged in the law and religion discourse in Germany, relating to ritual slaughter and circumcision. So, without further ado, Shai, go ahead.
Thank you, Peter. And really, you don't need to choose between the siesta and hearing me. You can do both. Okay, so my background is in sociology of law, and what I'll be presenting today is part of a larger project which deals with the history of animal slaughter, the ritual of animal slaughter in Germany. The project goes from discussing Jews in the 19th century to talking about Muslims today, and I'll be skipping back and forth. My next project will be on circumcision, so I've integrated parts of this, although I have not studied this at the same length, into this talk, so that it's not only about the case of animal slaughter. So let me begin with a case which will set the stage, and in fact I'll use it as an illustration for the remainder of the talk. In 1982, a German meat producing company applied to the local authorities of North Rhine-Westphalia, at the time in West Germany, for an exemption from stunning animals prior to slaughter. The law made the stunning of warm-blooded animals mandatory as part of a general concern with the prevention of cruelty to animals. As most of you know, this is the big issue with Jewish and Muslim slaughter, that it causes unnecessary pain and suffering to the animal, allegedly. The company based its claim on freedom of religion, arguing that some of its clients were Muslim Turks who were prohibited to consume the meat of animals that were stunned prior to slaughter. The company further argued that denying such a right would violate the principles of equal treatment, since Jews in North Rhine-Westphalia have long been granted such an exemption. In its decision from October 5, 1983, the administrative court at Gelsenkirchen denied the appeal. The court rejected the allegation of unequal treatment, basing its decision on the following grounds, and I'm quoting: "The permission for Jews to slaughter represents an act of political, cultural, and humanitarian compensation to the Jews who are still alive, the noch lebenden Juden. The Jewish religion has in Germany a greater historical tradition than the Muslims. Jews have integrated more or less into the people, into the Volk, as Germans, with essentially the same rights and duties. There exists no violation against the principle of equal treatment with respect to the Muslims." This is a candid confession by the court, some would say tactless, the still living Jews, of the kind that one rarely finds in higher courts. In what follows, I wish to reflect on the generative grammar, the juridical syntax that makes such utterances possible, and that underlies not only this court's decision, but courts who have discussed these matters and have discussed the problem of how it is possible for Jews to slaughter, whereas Muslims are not allowed to slaughter, and this was the situation in Germany for many years until 2002, how they make this claim, albeit in much more elegant fashion. So there are three methodological or perhaps theoretical premises that I'd like to advance in the following discussion, and you'll give me a 5-minute note so that I know that I need to wrap up. So the first point is this: the legal relationship to religious minorities, and specifically to Jews and Muslims in Germany, needs to be framed in terms of a complex semiotic system, or a comprehensive ecology of religions, in which the relationship of the state to the Muslim minority is understood vis-a-vis its relationship to the Jewish minority. So these things cannot be separated. The second and related presupposition is that the legal relationship to religious minorities, and specifically again to Jews and Muslims in Germany, needs to be understood vis-a-vis the Christian hegemonic religion, even if, or rather especially when, state law speaks the neutral and universal language of humanistic sensitivities, as in the case in the circumcision and animal slaughter debate. In Europe, and this argument has been made many times, in Europe the secular state is always a secularized Christian and specifically Protestant state, and the language of humanism and religion, even when genuine, should be understood within this context of secular Christian sensibilities. And Moshe Halbertal, who was sitting here before, said all this is good and well, but we can't talk about secularization in this sense as merely as only a Christian phenomena, because Jews have also gone through processes of secularization, and I don't want to deny that at all, but obviously these are very specific processes that Jews in Europe went through in a specific context. So even if we don't want to call these, the point isn't that it's Christian, but that it's historically and contextually sensitive, and that there is also an important Christian element that I'll point out as we go along. And the third point is that the relationship to minorities should not be understood as a simple mechanism of discrimination and exclusion. So the framework for this discussion is not Islamophobia and anti-Semitism as such. The three-way relationship between Jews, Muslims, and Christians takes a variety of forms. The basic model in Germany that I'd like to propose is that Jews are an internal other, and Muslims are an external other, and there are other models that we can think about and that I'll point to, including what is important for the discriminating between Jews and Muslims, which is the Judeo-Christian Bond. And then, if we have time towards the end of the talk, I also want to talk about the Judeo-Muslim bond. So basically, what I'm interested in is the baptizing of Judaism and Islam into a specific secular Europe, which entails a twofold process. On the one hand, a process of secularization, which I'll emphasize two aspects of which is the temporalization of tradition, the idea of progress basically, and the humanization or the rise of a humanistic ethics. That's on the secularization side. And then on the ritualization side, a certain notion of religion as ritual, or these practices as ritualistic practices, and the emphasis on ritual, as well as legalization of religion, or in fact a positivistic understanding of religious law. So we'll see how much of this I'll be able to condense into the talk, but this is the basic framework. So beginning with this notion of secularization and the temporalization of tradition. And much of this will be telegraphic. So Jewish law, if we go back to the 19th century, and specifically the dietary code, became a central indicator for the ability of Jews to become part of a modern German society. Ever since Christian Wilhelm von Dom's famous 1781 treatise concerning the amelioration of the civil status of the Jews. If we jump forward to the first animal slaughter debate in the Reichstag, in a petition to the Reichstag, the National Association of Animal Protection argued that, quote, even religious views are not unchangeable, but must conform to the progressing standards of humanity and education. And similarly, when we explore the Muslim discussion, jumping again forward, Roland Kochs, the premier of German state of Hessen, stirred public controversy when he demanded equally that Muslims adjust their habits and practices to those of German society. In residential areas with a high number of immigrants, there must be clear laws of the game. The slaughtering of animals in the kitchen run counter to our principles. So the expectation from 19th century German Jews and 20th century German Muslims was that they should adjust their religions to the norms of the secular state, which in important ways were the norms of growing sensitivities of humanistic sensibilities to pain and suffering. And I think there's an interesting analog here between the pain and suffering of the helpless animal in the slaughterhouse and the suffering of the painless, of the helpless child undergoing circumcision. Now, on this scale of progress, given this scale, Jews and Muslims could be measured differently. So that when we look both at the practices of animal slaughter and at the practices of circumcision, there are different ways or different elements of the Jewish practice that are emphasized in German discussion that make it on this scale more progressive, more humanistic, and including, for example, the role of the professional circumciser and the professional animal slaughter, the shochet, which in Jewish tradition has gone a certain level of professionalization, which does not exist, at least not among the Turks in Germany, and this is somehow an indication for progress on this line. So a few words on the ritualization of religion. So this goes back, and we all know this story, this goes back to German pietism and the way in which Jewish and Muslim practices in general were ritualized, were understood to be somehow not religious enough in this pietist and later in this Kantian sense. And specifically the ritual of slaughter, its ritualistic aspects have been emphasized, interpreted commonly as having to do with the prohibition of the consumption of blood. And Christian pietists argued that this was a result of Jews and Muslims mistakenly identifying the soul of the animal and its life power. This was, in their mind, a superstitious belief because of the soul of the animal was obviously not in its blood, and consuming animal blood could not have the effect on human spirit. The drawing out of animal blood cannot have religious significance. The pietists argued it unduly prolongs the process of dying and consequently the suffering of animals, and this is already in the 18th century, long before the modern, what we associate as the modern controversies about this. So the pietists believe that true religion is based on the inner conviction and the work of the heart. And for them, the problem became how to nevertheless maintain some kind of ethics of animal care, a modern notion, secular Christian understanding of what that meant. And so Christian, too, the pietist argues, have a law governing their relationship to animals, and yet as opposed to Jewish and Islamic law, quote, the practice of this law and its scope are hard to determine by external laws and will therefore be delimited by the voice of one's own conscience and duty. And this is the new notion of morality, of a humanistic attitude towards animals. And the Christian account did not only criticize Jews and Muslims for morally mistreating animals, they were also echoing Kant's critique, or Kant echoes their critique, of Judaism and Islam, which based their religion on external ritualistic practices rather than an internal moral, spiritual commitment. But even on this base, on this shared basis of criticizing Jews and Muslims for having ritualistic practices, again, Jews and Muslims figure differently. And this we already see in the debate in the Reichstag in the late 19th century, when eventually the ban on animal slaughter, in that context Jewish animal slaughter, does not pass due to support from the Catholics. So the Catholics, and this is in context of the post-Kulturkampf in Germany, the Catholics protect the Jewish ritual, but the way they protect it is not only in the name of freedom of religion, but also, and here's a quote from Windhorst, who was the leader of the Central Party, the Christian Party, and he gives the following justification. I have looked into the matter and I am convinced that Orthodox Jews will take a great offense at this proposal, and so they must do, the proposal to ban Jewish practice of animal slaughter, because the proposal stands in conflict with the views which they have had since youth, views which originate out of Mosaic times, which we too have experienced in the first days of Christianity, since we can indeed be confident that the early Christians still observed the aforementioned commandments. So there's this imagination of a shared Judeo-Christian heritage, which, as we've seen in the early quote from the court, the Muslims do not belong to. How am I doing?
Doing absolutely fine.
Thank you. And in terms of minutes?
You have plenty of time, don't worry.
Okay.
I'll let you know when you have
please do.
5 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. So, But then, still in the 19th century, comparison of Jews and Catholics, though present in some of the publications of the time, were not by no means a consensus. So again, this is another interesting quote from a different point of view. Somebody, Christian, criticizing Jewish custom, suggesting that it should rather be equated with Muslims, who are known for their cruelty to animals, and he says supporters of the ritual occupy the same cultural level as adherents to the Quran. So there's this continuous tension. I want to move to talking about a different aspect of this, of how religion is perceived, and specifically about what I mentioned earlier as the legalization of religious law, or the positivation of religious law. What does it mean to have a religious law? And when the courts, the higher courts, have to explain and justify the discrimination against, or the unequal treatment of Muslims with respect to Jews, they come up with three different arguments why Jews should be permitted to practice animal slaughter and Muslims should be prohibited, and they all have to do with the specific understanding of what is religious law. And so the first argument, I'll go over this briefly, the first argument is that as opposed to Jews, for Muslims, the exact specificities of the ritual are not binding, are not religiously mandated, because it doesn't say anywhere how exactly the Muslim practice should be done, and so the courts undermine the legitimacy of the Muslim objection to stunning. The second position that the courts take on this is, again, having to do with the positivistic rendering of law. They say these Turks, and this is truer in the 80s in the conception of Germans than today, but these Turks here are actually, these Muslims here are Turks, Turkish nationals, and hence we should apply not their own understanding, self-understanding of Islamic law, but rather what they practice in Turkey, what the Turkish religious institutions tell us about these practices, and they send for advisory opinions about the Muslim position in Turkey, and of course get the answers that they want, that is, that stunning is permitted. And the third way is talking about the religious corporation, that is, that Jews, as opposed to Muslims in Germany, have a standing under public law, the Körperschaft des öffentliches Recht, that is the corporate body under public law. The Jews are organized and hence have a clear religious institutions, and hence also a body that can pronounce what the law is, whereas Muslims do not have this kind of formal institutional setting, and hence whatever positions they have about law are merely about Muslim law are merely subjective, and they don't have the official positive nature. Now, bearing this in mind, I would want to say a few words about Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, but again in this context of, on the one hand, a shared understanding of Jews and Muslims, but then also a distinction between the Jews and the Muslims. And so, broadly stated, and again I have quite a bit of evidence for this in the longer version of the paper, but it's interesting to point out that both Jewish and Muslim slaughter, and the same is true about circumcision, were associated with violence, but very different notions of violence. And I think that this is an interesting distinction. So the Jewish practice of animal slaughter in the 19th century was associated and stereotyped as related to a thirst for blood among Jews, but one that was done in private and concealed and behind closed doors. And this tied very nicely into the blood libels, which we're all familiar with. That is the idea that Jews actually, in secret, killed Christian boys and used their blood. And this was tied into the discussion of animal slaughter, because often the person accused of being involved in these murders, alleged murders, was the local slaughterer. That is, the person in charge of slaughtering. Now, if we move to the Muslim context, and this again appears in the 90s and early 2000s in German public media, we again see an association of Islam with violence and with the thirst of blood, but one very different from the Jews, in the sense that again in public media and even in the Spiegel, there's an association of animal slaughter with terror, that is, with the public rather than private and secretive expression of violence. And again, violence is the common denominator here, but then again, this notion of the Jews as an internal other, that is, as somebody who looks like Germans and seems to be German, but in secret turns out that he's a Jew, as opposed to the Muslim who has the outer appearance of a stranger. So I think this is almost time to conclude. So I want to conclude on a more optimistic note, and rather than talking about the Judeo-Christian bond and how that affects the position of the two minorities in Germany, I'd like to talk about an emerging bond between Jews and Muslims in Germany with respect to the animal slaughter case. And what I have for you, and with which I will conclude, is a short section from Zafer Janokok's, a Turkish-born German author who writes about his experiences as a child in Germany. And this is what he says. It was the first winter after our arrival in Germany. Anton was visiting me. "Where's your Christmas tree?" he asked, standing in our living room. I asked my mother where our Christmas tree was. My mother asked my father where our Christmas tree was. My father asked God above about the Christmas tree. God above disappeared. Sometimes I went shopping with my parents. We took the tram into town. I loved the blue trams, which had their own peculiar smell, which gave me headaches. A highlight of these trips was the visit to the butcher. Butcher shops have always fascinated me. Nowhere else can one see so much blood and raw meat. Our butcher was a friendly, elderly man with a calm, gentle face. He had the usual physical proportions of a butcher. Sometimes he wore a small skull cap, slightly smaller than the one my father owned. The visit to the butcher always involved conversations, which I did not understand. The butcher wasn't alone in the shop. An ancient man with a long beard was often sitting on a chair in the corner. A gray beard probably made him older. The gray beard probably made him older than he was. He spoke to my father about God, and I didn't understand what God was doing in the butcher's shop. My father called the man with the beard a chacham. He was happy to see him there. We can be sure that the meat is clean, he said. And this is actually reflects the practice of Muslims in Germany during the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, actually, who would go to Jewish butcher shops to practice the butcher. And the same thing is still happening in Germany with respect to circumcision. That is, that often Muslims who would want to circumcise their child seek a Jewish doctor.
No. Questions. You cannot escape questions. Yes.
I'm very interested in the subject, so if you could explain the technical details and maybe how those technical details are used by opponents of both circumcision and kosher slaughtering. So on the kosher slaughtering, why is it that the Muslims will eat kosher but the Jews won't eat halal? I've never completely understood this. There's some similarity. I know that there are interesting differences with regard to the utensils, but that's, I think, a different question. But it has something to do with, anyway, I'd like you just to explain the technical questions of the percentage of blood and etc. Now, on circumcision, this is really puzzling to me because the Muslim circumcision takes place right at some time during puberty, like 13 years old. How can a moil do an operation like that without anesthesia? Or, I mean, it strikes me as a totally different operation for which the moil is not prepared.
Okay, so both are good questions. And so the simple answer to the first question is that Jews require a Jew to practice the slaughter, period. That is, a non-Jew cannot slaughter for a Jew, whereas for Muslims, it varies. Some Muslims follow Quranic teachings that suggest that if people of the book slaughter in the name of God, then the slaughtering would be halal. And some Muslims, and more today, are actually trying to distinguish themselves from the Jews and are not relying on this possibility. So there are also differences in the specificities. Jewish ritual slaughter is much more, in many ways, much more detailed in the demands that it has about the knife, about the manner of slaughter, and we could go into this. And the interesting reversal question was when Jewish slaughter asked the rabbi if he could slaughter for a Muslim, and the rabbi said, "Why not? You can slaughter for the Muslims." No. The Muslim wants me to bless Allah before I perform the slaughter. Am I allowed to do this? And the rabbi says, "Okay, let's see what." Blessing God is always good, no matter in whose name. And the problem that you think you have, which is a separation between the blessing in Hebrew and the slaughter, which is also sometimes a problem, you're not allowed to stop. But this is not considered to be a stop because it's in the same context of blessing God. So that. And with respect to circumcision,
So the olive thing was okay.
the Allah thing was fine.
Allowed to go to a mosque.
I mean, kosher is more restricted than halal, so.
Yeah, in some ways, kosher is more strict than halal, but it's.
So if it's kosher, you know.
But then again, I mean, there's no one halal. So, as far as circumcision goes, it's no longer the case, and it probably was never quite the case in this way that circumcision takes place only in puberty, and more Muslims now, especially in Europe, perform circumcision at a much earlier date. So the question of when exactly circumcision needs to take place is also something that's open, at least in the sense that different communities practice it, have different rulings on when to practice it, and the court uses this to say, okay, so if there's no unified Muslim opinion on this, so let them circumcise later. We won't allow them to circumcise the children when they're young. We'll wait until they're 14, when they can make up their mind and whether they want to be circumcised or not. So this is again part of the positivistic interpretation of Islamic law by the courts, which limit the practice.
I'm interested in that positivistic understanding, but I was wondering if you could connect it with the other point you were making about how Jews have private violence and Muslims have public violence, so that there's this inner-outer, and how that directly affects the typical German court's construction of law. Like, do they also see Jewish law then as something private and Islamic law as something public? And therefore, does that in some way, you see what I'm saying?
No, I see what you're saying, and I guess it's hard to find that in the courts. And the reason why I brought this up at all is because I wanted to tie whatever was going on in the courts, which is much more subtle and elegant, with what was happening in the public media and the kind of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism that we see. So my point wasn't that the court was being anti-Semitic or Islamophobic, but rather that you see the same kind of structure. Now, with respect to animal slaughter, this actually, this is in the media a lot. That is that the streets are full of blood, right? That the Muslims practice this sometimes outdoors, and then there's a public spectacle of this. I think that the whole, and this is a slightly different point, but I think that the whole question of animal suffering in public is a very interesting question to study. That is, usually we think of secularism as interested in morality only as a private matter. And with respect to animals, you can see that it's a much more complicated, there is a public morality with respect to suffering of animals that develops in Europe in the 19th century. And I think this is another angle on this question.
But, sorry, just to follow up on that. So, but what I meant was also, is it the case, though, that they see Jewish law as fitting within their secular framework because it's private law, whereas Islamic law does not fit into their framework because it's seen as public law?
I see your point, and it might be true about other cases, but not about animal slaughter and circumcision. Not so much so.
Yes, my interest is the conflict between the human rights discourse and the religious freedom discourse, and ultimately the human rights discourse trumps religious freedom, and so the extent to which basically in the German public opinion precisely violence done against a child is basically a violation of human rights, and therefore it trumps any notion that the Jewish or the Jews, they will not say it. Obviously, without the support of the Jews, they will have Trump and the Muslims. But obviously, it's very difficult for the Germans to trump on Jewish freedom. So my point is to which extent it indicates the fundamental conflict with the human rights discourse that ultimately is international rights, human rights course, is the one that decides and ultimately trumps religious freedom.
Okay, so I think that the reason why it's interesting to look at circumcision side by side, it's looking at animal slaughter, is precisely because it unsettles this notion of what we mean when we talk about human rights. Because when it comes to animals, it's clearly not about human rights. Okay, so now what is this humanitarianism when it's applied to animals? And why? So part of what I ask in the larger project is, what can we make of this new sensitivity, which is not simply a sensitivity about the human suffering, but about a specific kind of suffering? And I think that this combination of, from a secular point of view, of the suffering of the helpless, the unnecessary suffering of the helpless, even if it's minor, even if it's, worse things happen in the world. But there's something about this connected to religion which makes this kind of suffering unbearable to secular sensitivity. So I'm interested in kind of writing the genealogy of where this sensitivity comes from. And I find it, I'm not the only one who finds this new sensitivity, at least in the German context, among pietists. So it has its origins within religious Christian worldview, at least in this specific context.
What about the possibility of having different take on Muslim and Jewish practices, to see it as something else that the Germans cannot afford to see Jewish practices as a threat, whereas they could still afford to see Muslim practices as a threat? And this is certainly something which emerges in the debate around the Bavarian crucifix cases, where you had these long processions of long-faced Bavarians dressed in lederhosen and dirndls carrying massive crucifix on the streets and lamenting about the demise of German culture. What was interesting then, when one of the Constitutional Court judges was interviewed about their decision, the judge took the following view: how we need to get rid of the crucifixes, because can you imagine how we are going to feel in 20 years where the majority of students are going to be Muslims and not Germans, and instead of crucifixes you have Quranic inscriptions around the school classrooms?
So I think you're right that after the Holocaust, obviously this is, and the courts say this explicitly also in what I was reading, that after the Holocaust it's almost impossible to deny Jews freedom of religion in Germany. That's why, for me, the interesting comparison isn't only between Jews and Germans today, Jews and Muslims today in Germany, but comparing Jews from the 19th century with Muslims today, and seeing how the same reactions, or not exactly the same, but a similar structure with variation, you see, and how Jews and a lot of their practices, their clothing, their rituals were under similar attack, or at least criticism, as the way you see today with Muslims. So yes,
fascinating. Well,
I have a question about what's happening with the constitutional norms themselves, because I'm conscious that early on there would be clearly a sense. Well, let me read a phrase from the Weimar Reichsverfassung, which is it's about religious autonomy in a way, but it's relevant. Religious societies shall regulate and administer their affairs independently within the limits of the law that applies to all. And that phrase, within the limits that applies to all, is a term, it goes back to the Prussian Landgesetz and then comes down. And it evolves over time. So how does how do these cases interact with the evolution of the interpretation of that clause?
So I think that part of what this study shows is that constitutional courts is not the place to necessarily to look at for understanding this, what's going on here. In the 19th century, a lot is happening in the Reichstag and as a matter of law and regulation, and never makes it to the courts as a question. In Germany, it's different in Austria in the 19th century. And today, I think, though the Constitutional Court had made a decision in 2002 to give equal rights to Muslims so that now Muslims and Jews can practice animal slaughter, it ends up being a question of administrative law. That is, once you go down to the administrative level, you see that despite the Constitutional Court decision, in practice, and I've been interviewing Muslims about this, in practice, Muslims find it hard and in practice impossible to perform ritual slaughter because of the high requirements of the administration. What the administration does is says, you want to practice this is your religion and this is your commitment, give me a list of people who are committed to this. Show me the numbers, because not all Muslims are committed to this. So I want to know how many, I'll allow you to slaughter, but only once you can show me that you actually have this community. And the problem is, of course, that these Muslims are, from the point of view of the state, considered to be fundamentalists. And so nobody wants to put their name on this list. And de facto what happens is that Muslims can't actually practice animal slaughter without prior stunning in Germany today. So again, the Constitutional Court, you're right, there is a jurisprudential question to be asked about this, and the courts have resolved this in 2002, but in practice it's a very different story.
Fascinating. Well, on this note, let's thank our speaker once again for this great discussion.